Political rally. President Donald Trump discusses a number of topics, including Christians in Syria and refugees in the U.S. We're at the White House. Battle for religious freedom. One of the Democratic 2020 presidential candidates says if he's elected, churches could lose their tax-exempt status. We'll explain. Eye on the Supreme Court. We talk with a Democrat whose pro-life law is being challenged in the nation's highest court. And the newest saints, a preview of Sunday's canonization at the Vatican, including a closer look at Blessed Cardinal John Henry Newman. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, October 11th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. President Donald Trump says Democrats will pay for their impeachment inquiry at the ballot box. Last night, he spoke to thousands of supporters in Minneapolis, accusing Democrats of starting a campaign to impeach him just 19 minutes after he took the oath of office. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. President Trump says he's energized by the Democrats' attacks against him. Today, they called on a former ambassador to testify on Capitol Hill in the impeachment investigation.
They want to erase your voice, and they want to erase your future.
Despite the president's prediction of the Democrats' downfall, their impeachment inquiry continues. They're probing the president's request to Ukrainian officials to investigate political rival Joe Biden and his family. The latest Capitol Hill testimony came today from the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Lawmakers say the White House tried to block Marie Yovanovitch from appearing before them.
The Democrats' brazen attempt to overthrow our government will produce a backlash at the ballot box, the likes of which they have never, ever seen before in the history of this country.
And President Trump is defending life in the womb. He asked Congress to prohibit late-term abortion.
Virtually every top Democrat also now supports late-term abortion, ripping babies straight from the mother's womb right up to the moment of birth.
He's also promoting the administration's focus on helping Christian communities in the Middle East.
And we work hard with the Christians. We have tremendous evangelical support.
But some evangelicals are critical of the president's recent withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria and say Christians in the region could be more vulnerable to attack. And as refugees have fled war-torn areas in the Middle East, their chances of seeking safe haven in the U.S. are decreasing. President Trump has slashed the maximum number of refugees allowed into the country to a record low number.
Since coming into office, I have reduced refugee resettlement by 85%.
The Interfaith Immigration Coalition, which seeks to help refugees, pushes back. It condemns the president's approach and says many faith communities in the U.S. would welcome more refugees.
And today here at the White House, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin spoke to reporters. He's warning Turkey it could face powerful new sanctions if it goes too far in its attack on the Kurds in Syria. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. A Democratic presidential candidate says he wants to take away tax-exempt status from churches. The reason? Their support for the traditional definition of marriage, one man and one woman. It came during what organizers call a TV First, a night of town halls on same-sex attraction and so-called transgender issues. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi has reaction from Christians.
Do you think religious institutions like colleges, churches, charities, should they lose their tax-exempt status if they oppose same-sex marriage?
Yes.
Presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke targets churches.
There can be no reward, no benefit, no tax break for anyone or any institution, any organization in America that denies the full human rights and the full civil rights of every single one of us.
So what do Christians make of Beto O'Rourke's comments last night? Well, we came here to the Values Voters Summit, a gathering of conservative Christians from around the country, and asked them that very question.
freedom of religion means that you can preach whatever you want to in churches as long as it's not inciting violence. And I don't think anyone's saying that opposing same-sex marriage is inciting violence. And so what he's saying he wants to do is he wants to use the cudgel of the government to bully churches and bully Christians into whatever he wants to believe.
Colleges, churches, charities, should they lose their tax-exempt status if they oppose same-sex marriage?
And of course, they want to stop the Word of God.
We also speak with Jennifer Robach Morse, founder of the Ruth Institute, which defends and promotes marriage.
Dr. Morse, your reaction to that?
Well, there you have it. I mean, we've been saying since 2008 that this is what it means that passing same-sex marriage will result in the government coming down with both feet on religious institutions and individuals. And there you are. They're not even ashamed of it anymore.
President Trump tomorrow will speak to these Christians, people who helped him win the White House. In Washington, Jason Calvi, EWTN News Nightly.
And joining me now from the Values Voter Summit in Washington, D.C. is Eric Metaxas, author and host of the Eric Metaxas Show. Eric, welcome back to the broadcast. I want to start off by getting your reaction to Democratic presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke's comments from last night. What did you think?
I think that there's a level of buffoonery whenever he is talking, so he's hard to take seriously. But the issue is extraordinarily serious. In America, we have ceased to understand what it is to be an American. We have forgotten what religious liberty is. All the things that have made us as great as we've been for nearly 2.5 centuries, we have forgotten. And because we've forgotten these things, people like Beto O'Rourke can make outrageous statements. He has basically said that he would like to abrogate religious liberty. If you can force Christians, go to a Greek Orthodox priest, I grew up in the Greek Orthodox Church, and say, you must marry same-sex couples, that's an absurdity. We have religious liberty in America, and this amounts to the establishment of a religion, because when you talk about fundamental things like sexuality and the human person, and you impose a particular view, you are abrogating religious liberty. So it is absurd, but we need to take it seriously.
Another story gaining a lot of attention this week is President Trump's decision to withdraw U.S. troops from northern Syria. He's received some criticism for it, including from people of faith who are concerned about the impact it would have on the religious minorities living in the region. How do you think this decision is resonating with his evangelical base?
Well, I think, first of all, this president knows and should know that most evangelical Christians in America really love him. So when they speak up the way many of us have been doing about something, he does need to take it seriously. He probably needs to explain himself better. There are rare cases where I would say that a president ought to explain himself for clarity. It comes with the office that he has that obligation sometimes. Perhaps we're missing something in criticizing him. I hope and pray that we are, or I hope and pray that he has some contingency that he hasn't shared yet. But it's an extremely important issue, and when we dissent with him, particularly those of us who love him and support him, I think he's listening.
Turning now to the Democrats' impeachment inquiry, we heard President Trump say last night that it's going to hurt those lawmakers with voters. How do you think this inquiry has been handled by both parties so far?
I think the impeachment inquiry, so-called, scare quotes around both words, is so absurd that I hardly know what to make of it. Most Americans know that you cannot impeach a president on, for example, what is in that transcript. You may not like it. You may say it was politically incorrect of him. It was unwise of him to say such a thing. You can say anything, but the idea that it rises to the level of an impeachable offense is simply lunacy. And I think it's going to backfire very badly, because what it's going to do is it's going to bring out many of the things, largely surrounding this issue of corruption, that would have been hidden. I think when we look at the quid pro quo of Hunter Biden and his father in Ukraine and in China and all of those things, it's going to be very bad for the Democrats. I'm sure of it. I will wait and see, but I'm pretty sure of that.
I'm running out of time, Eric, but before I let you go, Donald Builds the Wall is your latest book in your series about Donald the Caveman, illustrated by Tim Ragland. These are intended, of course, to be children's books, but for us adults out there who read them, what's the central message you're hoping to get across?
I just happen to have a few copies here for you. It's meant to be funny but serious, right? That's kind of my personality. It's basically about a caveman named Donald. And the first book was Donald Drains the Swamp. He goes against all these swamp creatures. It's about taking your government back. Donald Builds the Wall is about the idea of having a sovereign government and what freedom is and who gets to be part of it. These are fundamental ideas and values that can be presented in a simple way for children to understand. But when you present something so simply that kids can understand it, adults get it too. There's a lot of humor in here for adults. There's a vicious gang called the MSNBC 13 gang. There's an AOC character who has something called the Green Raw Deal. There's a lot of comedy. It's intended to let people learn and laugh at the same time, and I think we need more of that, and I hope people will get a copy.
Eric Metaxas, host of the Eric Metaxas Show, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your analysis.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
Businessmen with ties to Rudy Giuliani are accused of lobbying a congressman for help ousting the American ambassador to Ukraine in 2018, but the congressman denies the claim. Igor Fruman, shown on the left, and Lev Parnas were arrested yesterday on campaign finance charges. The allegations stem from a $325,000 donation to a political action committee supporting President Trump. Iran says 2 missiles struck one of its oil tankers traveling through the Red Sea. The attack occurred just off the coast of Saudi Arabia. It is the latest incident in the region amid months of tensions between Tehran and the United States. No one has claimed responsibility for the strike. The Polish Bishops' Conference will begin the canonization process for the parents of St. John Paul II. The first step is asking the Vatican to look into their cause. The couple gave birth to 3 children. They were known to be faithful Catholics and rejected the anti-Semitism of the time. For more on the story, including a look at St. John Paul II's childhood, visit our partners at CatholicNewsAgency.com. Several church leaders offered their take on the first 5 days of the Vatican's Synod on the Amazon. Cardinal Carlos Reyes of Mexico says the meetings are a call to abandon the throwaway culture, adding climate change particularly strikes the poor. Archbishop Dom Pedro Brito Reyes of Brazil says we have no other planet which to live, so we should take better care of this one. Coming up, a lawmaker from Louisiana tells us why she calls herself a whole-life Democrat. Pro-life supporters will have to wait a while before the Supreme Court issues a ruling on a Louisiana law that sparked a national debate on abortion. The justices are not expected to hear arguments until the end of this year, and a decision is likely to come by the end of June, just a few months before the 2020 presidential election. The law requires doctors who perform abortions in Louisiana to have admitting privileges at a nearby hospital. Joining me now from the Values Voters Summit in Washington, D.C. is Louisiana State Representative Katrina Jackson, a pro-life Democrat. Representative Jackson, welcome into the broadcast. You authored the 2014 pro-life law that's at the center of this case before the Supreme Court. Why was it important to you originally to seek this legislation?
It was important because of women's health. In the state of Louisiana, for a number of years, we've had a law that said that any surgical center in the state of Louisiana, that the physician performing any procedure, regardless of how minor of that procedure was, had to have admitting privileges to a hospital within a 30-mile radius. The legislators from years ago that authored that legislation thought that it encompassed abortion clinics as well. We found out that a technicality existed because abortion facilities were in a different part of the law, and so abortion facilities were the only facilities in Louisiana where a physician could perform a procedure outside of a hospital without having admitting privileges within a 30-mile radius. So it was so important to legislate in areas of women's health because we don't want to relax the standards for abortion providers that we require for anyone else performing any procedure, regardless of how minimal it is.
And when you talk about the issue of abortion here, I know you've described yourself as a whole-life Democrat. What do you mean by that term, whole-life Democrat, and how is your position rooted in your faith?
Everything that I do is rooted in my faith. When I look at legislation, my first question is always, how does this impact what God believes and what God has taught us to believe and how we react to things? being a whole life Democrat was so important for me because we feel in Louisiana, and the Governor Edwards and I talk about this all the time, is a difference in being pro-birth and being pro-life. And so as a whole life Democrat, we are pro-birth, but we're also pro-life, which means once a mother or a father who's raising that child chooses life and chooses to raise that child, if they don't have enough resources, if things are a little hard on them, we believe in making sure they have every opportunity to realize the American dream, regardless of what background they came from, socioeconomic, culturally, that there are programs to give them a hand up and not a handout, that there are centers to help them, and that when we legislate with them in mind, that it's easier for us to ask a woman or a father, whoever's going to raise that child, to choose life if there are programs, not only programs, but if there's a support system, if there are laws, if our schools are properly funded, so regardless of where you live, your child has a good education. Those are the things that we consider ourselves as whole life Democrats to advocate for, that are encompassed in choosing life. All encompassed in choosing life is that we also support our educational system. We support our healthcare system. We support what that child is going to need after birth to make sure they realize the American dream.
And I'm sure there are a lot of people who agree with you, Representative, but you know all of the Democratic presidential candidates have expressed their support for abortion. As a Democrat who supports life like you at all stages, are you concerned by the direction the party appears to be moving?
Oh, of course, you're always going to be concerned. I'm concerned when anyone is pro-choice. And I am a member of the Democrats for Life. And nationally and in our state, we're now looking at these issues, and we're all the time discussing what a whole life Democratic candidate should look like. I tell a lot of people should look a lot like Governor John Bel Edwards, who's the governor in Louisiana, who's a Democratic governor, and who just signed not only my bills into law and other bills, but also signed the heartbeat bill into law. And so we are looking at that. And right now I have not lent my support to any candidate that's running for president because of that. And listen, it goes past that. Because I'm a whole life Democrat, we're looking for a presidential candidate who will support life, who will support birth, and who will support life after birth. And so it's very concerning as we move toward the presidential elections that we are being asked that question, but we're asking ourselves that question first. And we are slowly advocating and pushing and trying to make sure and talking to those candidates to see who will support life. And it's always time to change your mind. It's always time to come on the other side of this issue and support life.
All right, Louisiana State Representative Katrina Jackson, such an important topic. Thank you for coming on and talking with us about it today.
Thank you for having me.
Up next, a report from Rome ahead of Sunday's canonization of 5 new saints, including Cardinal John Henry Newman. It's a busy time at the Vatican. The Holy See is hosting the Synod on the Amazon region until the end of the month. And Sunday, Pope Francis will canonize 5 new saints, including Cardinal John Henry Newman. Newman was a 19th century theologian and poet. He originally was an Anglican priest. He later converted to Catholicism. His works are among the most important contributions to the Church in recent history. EWTN contributor Colin Flynn has more on Newman's life and legacy.
130 years after his death, Cardinal John Newman is going to be made a saint by Pope Francis. He will be the first English person since the 17th century to be declared a saint by the Catholic Church. So who was John Newman, and what made him so remarkable that thousands of people will be flocking to the Vatican in Rome this Sunday to witness his canonization? Newman was born to a wealthy banking family in London in 1801 and went on to study in some of England's top schools. Growing up in a religious house, he was always deeply interested in religion and studied it diligently. He sought truth in religion. While studying and later teaching at Oxford University, he was ordained a minister in the Church of England, but continued to study the history of early Christianity.
A man like most fellows of Oxford colleges at the time, who becomes a clergyman in the Church of England. He's ordained and becomes vicar of the university church.
In 1845, he became a Catholic at 43 years of age. A year later, in 1846, he became a priest in Rome and returned to England to become a powerful preacher and defender of the faith.
He understood how difficult it was to believe in the 19th century, the age of rationalism, and he helped Catholics.
He was an intellectual and wrote prolifically in prose, poetry and hymns, becoming one of the leading theologians of the 19th century.
He had single-handedly changed public opinion, so it had become okay to be Catholic. You know, he opened the door.
He believes in a religion that is a religion of truth, not opinion, but a religion that has to appeal not only to the head, but to the heart.
And let's go now to Rome, where Colin Flynn is on hand in St. Peter's Square. Colin, how are preparations going there for the canonization?
Good evening, Wyatt. Organisers are predicting that tens of thousands of pilgrims and well-wishers will be packed into St. Peter's Square here in Rome this Sunday for the canonization of arguably one of the most important figures in 19th century Britain. Cardinal Newman will be the first British-born saint since the Reformation. All previous English saints have been martyrs from that time. So this is a hugely significant day, not just for the Catholic Church in the United Kingdom, but the faithful all over the world who have been following Newman and his works. And you saw there in the package and the story about his life, Jack Valero. He is the media coordinator for the entire canonization. He's here with me now in St. Peter's Square. Jack, education was a huge passion of his, and he saw it very much aligned with religion. Explain that.
Well, seeking the truth, but also his idea of education at university being an education for life, not a preparation for a particular job as a lawyer or as a doctor or as a mechanic, but education for life, studying classics, history. And he gave those lectures, which have been collected in the idea of a university, which has become the reference text for people in tertiary education everywhere in the English-speaking world. Even to this day, as you go around universities in Oxford, Cambridge, they're still talking about his book. But he didn't only just preach and write. He actually started a university in Ireland, which remains to this day in UCD. And he didn't just talk about secondary education. He actually started a school. So you have this amazing combination of a man who's extremely clever and can work out what the really important things are and then put it into practice and make it happen. You know, usually people are divided into those who do the thinking and those who do the doing, and here's a man who does both. So that's amazing. And then he brings this into the Catholic Church, and he's also a saint. So many things we're celebrating with this canonization.
And UCD went on to become one of the biggest universities in Ireland today. Another thing I want to ask you about, I know the United Kingdom and the royal family are being represented by Prince Charles, who's coming this Sunday, but what else are you expecting on the day?
Well, there's a big delegation from the Anglican Church who was also delighted with the event, and they're celebrating. There are 19 Catholic bishops. There's the mayor of Birmingham, who's a Muslim. He's also coming because he meant so much to Birmingham. He spent over 40 years there. One thing that I expect from the canonization is that so many more people will hear of Newman now. Newman is a person from the 19th century who has a lot to say to people of the 21st century. So it's great that we're celebrating it now, because so many more people around the world are going to hear about him, are going to read his writings, are going to hear his sermons, and are going to be moved by all the things he did.
Jack Valero, it was great talking to you. Well
Thank
done on all
you.
your hard work, and
Thank
enjoy
you.
Sunday. Well, as we've been saying, huge crowds expected here in St. Peter's Square. If you're not going to be one of the faces in the crowd, well, don't worry, because EWTN will be broadcasting the canonization in full live around the world and online too. Wyatt, back to you.
EWTN contributor Colin Flynn reporting from Rome. Thanks, Colin. Here to discuss one of the soon-to-be saints is Jonathan Reyes, Assistant General Secretary for Integral Human Development for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Jonathan, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Why is Cardinal John Henry Newman still relevant today? What is it that's so compelling about him?
You know, there's a kind of obvious answer to that, which is everyone still reads his books. He was one of the fathers of Vatican II. That's still part of the conversation. He's a saint. But, you know, one of the things I think makes him relevant is in his time, he was able to see what was coming, the kind of culture we're in now. So everything he said has relevance to right now. He anticipated a kind of move to atheism and away from the church. And because he knew that, everything he did, I think, still is as relevant today as it was then.
He was from England, but he had several ties to the United States. Can you tell us about some of them?
Well, isn't it interesting that the miracles that are going to be used for the canonization both happen in the United States? That's fascinating. But, you know, a number of ties, but one I would just like to point out is the Newman centers. We have over 2,000 Newman centers in the United States. This is the inspiration of John Henry Newman touching 2,000 some places here in the country where students are going and encountering Christ even in the midst of non-Catholic colleges. And they continue to be alive today. I was just at the celebration of one. They continue to advance the gospel.
I know that Newman was a convert to Catholicism. Is it rare for converts to become saints?
All the saints are converts, right, in one sense, right, because they've gone from something to something else. But from Anglicanism, no, and that's happened before. Elizabeth Ann Seton is the same story. But the fact that Newman, maybe what's different about Newman is his conversion it wasn't Pauline. It was slow over time, steady reading. And in that way, he's really remarkable, and I think a lesson today as well. It's not necessarily getting knocked off your horse for Newman. It's thinking, reading, praying your way into the fullness of faith.
Cardinal Newman, of course, was famous for saying the faithful should, quote, venture all for Christ. What do you mean by that?
He would say that kind of thing over and over again. That refers to a particular sermon, which is one of my favorites, actually, where he basically was looking around England, and he said, all of you people say you're Christian, but I want to test you. I want to find out, is it real for you? And so what he would say to them, he tested them once and he said, if the promises of Christ weren't true, would your life look any different? Have you ventured all such that everything you have is on the table, such that if Christ is true, all is well. If not, you lose something. And so that was what he was saying. Basically, we would say, are you all in? And that was one of his great gifts, to call people to the deepest level of discipleship.
Tell me more about this conversion of the heart, because you referenced this previously here. I mean, it's more than just being a convert to Catholicism. I mean, for him, it was very much about everyone coming to Christ in that way, in their own self.
Well, it's interesting. He emphasized something called the imagination. He said, he had this great line, persons influence us, voices melt us, eyes, looks subdue us, and deeds inflame us. And he had this clear sense that it's the influence of people through the imagination that reaches the heart, that brings them to the level of conversion that says not just I believe something, but I believe it with all that I am in my whole life. I'll risk everything on it.
Pretty amazing. A pretty amazing story, and of course, so many amazing things that we can learn from him. Jonathan Reyes, Assistant General Secretary for Integral Human Development for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Thanks so much for coming on.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And be sure to stick with EWTN as we continue to provide updates on the ongoing Synod and, of course, full coverage of the canonization Mass. And with that, we conclude our newscast for tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back on Monday with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.